He has been ranked as the #1 leadership columnist for Forbes.com. With over 50 million readers, his insights into business growth and overcoming organizational obstacles have been featured in more than 600 journals. The credentials include Adweek, Fortune, Inc. magazine. His columns have boldly predicted the success of industry game changers like Netflix, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Tesla. He's also helped his readers see the writing on the wall for companies like Sears, Kodak, and many others who were unable or unwilling to accept dramatic change. In 2020, the Global Innovation Institute invited Adam to join their board of advisors. He's been an executive with PepsiCo and DuPont, has an MBA from the Harvard Business School with distinction. And we say welcome and thank you for joining us, Adam Hartung, here on the Leadership Standard.
Thank you for that tremendous introduction, and I'm glad to be here.
And I have to just jump in because we were talking just before we went on how your entire career has been characterized likely by 2 words. And let me see if I can't accurately frame the question, especially now, given the global pandemic that we've all been experiencing. Adam, how does anyone thrive through marketplace disruption? How do you seize hidden market opportunities? Because I guess from you, we're about to find out.
The whole trick to being successful long-term in business is to realize that you have to be making every one of your decisions based upon the impact it will have at a future date. You can't make decisions based upon what's happening now. If you're doing that, you're already behind the 8 ball. You have to be thinking ahead. You have to be seeing where the world is going. And as the great Canadian Wayne Gretzky said, you have to skate to where the puck will be.
He did say that, skate to where the puck's going to go, not where it is. And I love it that you mentioned Wayne Gretzky because he wasn't the biggest or the fastest, but his gift was anticipation. That being said, you've also noticed, as I have, that many business leaders get blindsided. Why is that? Have you developed any theories?
Well, yeah, sure. So what happens in an organization is it's very easy to elevate people that came through the operational side of the business. And very often people in operational areas will tend to focus on specific metrics related to how the business is operating today. So they say, is the plant running safe? Is the plant running well? Is the output good? So you're looking at constant current metrics. And the reality is that does not prepare you for the future unless the future is going to look exactly like today. If the future is going to change at all those current metrics have minimal impact or minimal value as you get towards the future. So what happens is you can be running your business and doing extraordinarily well at running your business, but then something external happens and you're completely unable to deal with it.
And I guess the pandemic, Adam, would be a perfect example. What have you seen as a result of your established theories and how they've reacted or responded in the face of the pandemic?
Well, a lot of people think that the pandemic has caused us to behave wildly differently, and in fact, that's not true. In fact, everything we see happening today has been an acceleration of trends that existed before 2020 began as a calendar year. So let's just take, for example, work from home. Work from home started 20 years ago. People were trying to figure out how to get by with their phones. Then along came the email, and we were trying to figure out how to improve bandwidth to our home so we could work. And if it wasn't home, it was a hotel room, right? So you were working 24/7 in a hotel room in a remote location. Those things were just like home. Well, that movement was there. I mean, people were doing it. Increasingly, people were asking, why do I have to spend an hour each way commuting to an office? Why do I have to get on an airplane and spend 4 hours going to a meeting? They kept asking that question. And then what happened is we get this pandemic. And now, in mass, we start have to ask that question. So instead of an individual saying, I really don't want to go to this meeting, you have everybody saying, I don't want to go to this meeting. And now everybody starts to say, okay, let's start to look at, could we do this stuff without having to get on airplanes, get in our cars, et cetera. So what we think that this Zoom environment or this virtual environment is something that's pandemic oriented, but it's really not. It's really that the pandemic has accelerated those trends. The trend was already there. It just, the barriers to adoption of the trend went away. And most of those barriers to adoption were behavioral. It was, the status quo thinking. It was the executive that thought I need everybody in the office so I can look at what they do every day. It was somebody in, an administrative role that says we have to have offices for everybody. So they just had a way of thinking. They were stuck. They were locked in to the old way of thinking. The pandemic has knocked down those barriers and let these trends accelerate.
I'd love to hear your thought. You just reminded me of something a friend of mine, actually, from Halifax, Nova Scotia, said very early on that 1 week of this pandemic is probably equal to 3 to 6 months of change in the old world. What are you seeing, Adam, in terms of how rapid change is forcing its way through the economy?
Well, he might have understated it, to be quite honest with you. I mean, in 3 to 6 months, I think that we're seeing adoption much, much faster than that. Let's take, for example, the adoption of electronic commerce. Again, another trend that's been very visible for 20 years. People are buying more online. But you had these holdbacks, what we would call late adopters in the marketing world. Some of them were senior citizens. Some of them were just people that were anti-internet for whatever reason. Now forced to take a look at the fact they don't want to go out to a retail shopping store. They've started to adopt electronic commerce much more quickly, right? And so we're seeing much more than 6 months of jump. We're starting to see en masse or wholesale, vast percentages of the population move towards these new ways of getting things done. And that's just going to continue. It's like people, if you think that when the vaccines are out, and we all have one, and it's a year and a half from now, and we're theoretically safe. Okay, let's just get to that spot. If you really think we're going to be shopping in stores the way we used to, or eating in restaurants the way we used to, or going to movie theaters the way we used to, then you are literally problematic. It's just not going to happen. The trends that were there have just accelerated, and evolution never goes backward. Never goes backward. We're going towards the things we were headed towards before. We're just going there faster.
That's so well said, Adam. And I kind of want to go back to, before I get to this, I want to point out to everyone watching or listening that you've traveled to major conferences, speaking on the subject of disruptive innovation. When you look into your crystal ball, how do you see the world looking differently 2 to 3 years from now? Because I'm curious to know what you see.
Well, again, we're going to continue to shop more online, right? We're going to continue to operate more from home. One of the things that, just think in terms of synchronous versus asynchronous behavior. I can remember when I always answered the telephone. I almost never answer the telephone now. Why? Because synchronous communication takes time. It's not efficient. So what I look to do is have asynchronous communication. That's texting, it's email, it's putting something up in a podcast so somebody can look at it later, right? So you don't have to do it real time in a meeting or at a conference. So that's asynchronous. So what we're seeing is that those kinds of behaviors are going to continue to go forward. They're going to be augmented with improvements in the physical world. So you can expect that, for example, this whole idea of delivery in 2 hours or delivery in 1 day, it's going to get routine, right? Which is going to mean increasingly you don't have to leave your home if you don't want to. We're going to see the advent of autonomous cars, right? I go to people and I'll say, do you think in the future we're going to have a point where we have all autonomous cars? People will say, well, yeah, probably. That's someday out in the future. And I said, that could be 3 years, right? This thing is accelerating. When I was a young person, it was a badge of honor to have 3 cars, in your driveway, and they had to be big cars with big engines and things like that. That's not true anymore, right? We're seeing, a behavioral change in terms of what that means with people, even older people saying, do I really need these cars? Do I need these big cars? So those poles that we used to grab a hold of, right? They are no longer going to be set in the stone or the concrete that they were once in. And so therefore, these behaviors are going to change dramatically. We're going to be in a world very soon where you're going to do more stuff through the devices that you have in your hand, and you're going to be getting around more with, again, you couldn't have autonomous cars without artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is leading into our life through our speakers that listen to what we have to say, but even just tracking our movements on the internet, tracking how we get things done. We now come to expect that we're going to have smart devices that are going to figure out what we want, right? And we get annoyed. If we're done to our phone, it annoys us to have to say, take me to my and then read your address. You want to say, take me home. And you want the device to be smart enough to know what home means, right? And so that sort of, those activities, those kinds of impacts that are happening in the world today are combining, and they're going to have an enormous impact in 3 years, to where just the way we behaved in 2019 is going to look far more historic than many people think it is today.
Adam, I want to bring you back to this book you wrote called Create Marketplace Disruption. When you wrote the book, did you have any idea the world would be going through what it's going through right now? And when you look back, how accurate were some of the things you wrote about back then?
Well, okay, that book came out in 2007. And at the time, my biggest prediction was the financial crisis. And it was quite obvious to me that the way we had set up our financial institutions, the number of jobs that were in the financial industry, that it was set up for a crumble. It was set up for a takedown, right? And of course it did. We had the Great Recession, which had global impacts. And so that was the first big disruption that I was talking about at that time. Now, the big thing I'll come back to, though, is I always try to tell people when it comes to the macro disruptions, like the Great Recession and the pandemic we're in now, it's not really important that you know what the disruption will be. It's just important that you know that it will be. And you have to be preparing for these massive major disruptions. So let's take, for example, the advent of electric cars and autonomous vehicles. It was obvious something was going to happen that was going to push us towards that marketplace, just at the speed with which Tesla cars were selling, the fact they could sell out 100% of their inventory, the fact that there was so much money being poured into automation. Those things indicated that, yes, something was going to push that thing forward. I didn't know it's hard to predict the trigger, but what you can predict is the event. And you can predict that you will have this disruption and you'll end up on the other side. And so that's more the issue, that we need to realize that everybody's business is pretty seriously disrupted about every 4 years and dramatically disrupted every 8 to 9.
Adam, before Harvard, PepsiCo, DuPont, Forbes, et cetera, you were an up-and-coming prospect with the St. Louis Cardinals organization and a AAA ball player of some repute. I don't know if you were a slick-fielding infielder or a fleet-of-foot outfielder, but what I'm curious to know is this. What was your aha moment when it comes to this subject of disruptive innovation, and specifically when you realized in a business context things aren't nearly as linear as some of the business books or the programs like TQM or Six Sigma would have us believe?
Well, after business school, I worked at the Boston Consulting Group in the early 1980s. And at that time, almost everything we did related to strategy was improving operational performance. We all considered competitive strategy by Michael Porter to be the Bible. We were looking for cost curves, how to get to the lowest point position on cost curves, how to build distribution moats around your business. This was the biblical approach that we had to strategy at that time. I lived in that world, and I was a consultant. As you said, I went to Pepsi and DuPont and ran strategy. But then I realized as we were getting into the mid-1990s that if you took and you looked laterally across all these companies, the ones that hired the best consulting firms, the BCGs, the McKinseys, the Bains, were not doing statistically any better than those that didn't hire them. And what's more important was the ones that didn't hire them were doing as statistically well as the ones who did. And then you could see, in fact, where some of this work that had been done had actually damaged these companies. Like they'd paid millions of dollars for this strategy work. And in fact, it led them down a strategic path that then the rug got pulled out from under them and they collapsed. This was around 1995. And so as I was looking at that, I started saying, okay, we're producing a couple 100 million MBAs a year at that point. 200,000 MBAs a year. This is an enormously large number. Why aren't we getting better at managing? Why aren't we improving? We should be able to say in the 1940s when we had no MBAs, the average life on the S&P 500 was 42 years. Now that we have all these MBAs, the average time you spend on the S&P 500 is 62 years. But it had gone the opposite direction. We'd gone from 40 years to 16 years. So in fact, companies were not long-lasting. They were not sustaining. In fact, strategies were not creating long-term competitive advantage, but rather merely some short-term advantages that were often then collapsed out from under them. And so that was 1995 when I started saying, I have this really strong sense that what we've been doing isn't the right thing. In fact, I remember sitting around with a bunch of my colleagues saying, I have a fear that what we've been doing is the medicinal equivalent of bloodletting. We think we know what we need to do, but we're not getting the results, and therefore we need to rethink that.
So the only thing missing would have been the leeches in the consultants' briefcases? Is that what I'm hearing?
Or perhaps the notion that a lot of people thought us consultants were the leeches.
So what What was the stark revelation, in other words, the aha, where you saw that management consulting, if I'm understanding correctly, you saw a major, significant flaw in management consulting. What was
Yeah.
your solution?
So what happened was I started looking at the gurus of the time, the Tom Peters in Search of Excellence, the Jim Collins Built to Last, The Good to Great. And what you could see were that they would publish these books, and shortly after they published these books, the companies they would highlight would typically be in a lot of trouble, right? And it was almost like being published in one of these books was the kiss of death. And I didn't think really it was the kiss of death, but I said, it has to tell me something. And as I got to looking at it, I got to saying, well, what are these people saying? They're saying, focus, 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 focus. Focus on what? Focus on what you always did. Focus on the products you made. Focus on the customers you had. And then they would go so far as to say, focus on what you did and get rid of everything else. Don't waste your resources on doing something else. And that was when it started to dawn on me. What we were doing was we were building these very fragile organizations. They could do one thing, and they could do one thing very, very well. But what happened was then when the world would change, a new technology would come along, regulations would change, customer requirements would change, they were not adaptable. And that's why they were fragile. They couldn't adapt to anything external in the marketplace. The strategy work was also internally focused. It was around improving internal metrics. You talk to a retailer, it was around what's my sales per square foot? What's my margin per square foot? How could I improve my merchandising to try to get more SKUs per square foot of store? All that kind of thing. But then if you ask them, well, but what if people bought somewhere else? What if they went to a different kind of retailer? There was no view of that. The strategic planning had lost sight of the fact that there was an external world, there was an external market that was constantly producing new technologies, constantly producing new ways of getting things done. And that was when I really started to switch. And I started to say, we have to get more externally focused. We have to start getting data from the world, and we have to learn how to put that into our planning systems.
Adam, I can't help but wonder with this other book that you wrote about how Facebook, the making of a great company, what do you see that the Facebooks, the Netflixes, the Apples, the Amazons, the Teslas all share in common with respect to their ability to adapt and pivot?
Well, the first thing is that they start to get a pretty good handle on the technologies and where the technologies are going to head, right? What's going to be possible in 2, 3, 4 years. So rather than looking at technology only as it comes along and how do I accept it, they're planning for the technology in advance. Okay, that's the first step, right? The second step is looking at the behaviors of how people behave and what's important to them. You know, often we'll gauge our customer based upon what was important to them last year, but these companies will start saying, what do they want going forward? So one of the great stories that I like to tell is about Instagram. In the United States Congress, they just beat up Mark Zuckerberg, saying that he was trying to act like a monopolist by buying Instagram. Well, those of us that were there at the time and remember that he actually got the tar beat out of him because Facebook went public and then its stock dropped, right, after the IPO. And if you're a CEO of a company and your value goes down after an IPO, you got a lot of unhappy people. 6 months after that, and before the stock is recovered, he announces that he's going to buy Instagram, this company that has it's got like 10 employees and no revenues at all. And he's going to pay, I think it was $2 billion for the thing, right? And so you have to imagine this. The board of directors like, wait a minute, we got all these unhappy pension funds and big corporate investors and mutual funds, and you want to go drop all this money on a business that doesn't even have any revenues? But what they said, what his team said was, wait a minute, when we look at the world, we're seeing the emergence of images, and we're looking at oncoming small applications, and we're seeing that people are using pictures. And we built Facebook, yeah, it takes pictures, but it's not the core of what Facebook is. It's really about words and text. And what we need to get into this picture world, and that's where Instagram sits. So it was predicting this idea that in the future, instead of somebody saying, I had a cheese sandwich for lunch, they'd take a picture of a cheese sandwich, pop it onto some site, and that's it. You know, they would live with icons, images. They saw that behavioral change. And then they go ahead and they say, we got to buy this because we could build it. But if we spend 2 years building it, where will Instagram be in 2 years? They'll be that much ahead of us. We'll be in a catch-up game. So they make the commitment to spend all this money to get this technology, boom, like that. And now it takes them 3 years, but 3 years later, that business is making $600 million profit per quarter. So it's being able to look out and say, okay, where's happening? Where are the regulations headed? Where are the technology headed? And then where are behaviors headed? And how can I put those things together so that I can start to put myself in that place where the customer wants to be, with the solution the customer wants at that point in the future.
Adam, you're talking to business leaders all the time, and from all, from every industry, every category, all products and services represented. Because we do this podcast and we call it the leadership standard, what are your views right now on the qualities, the characteristics of a successful leader? What do you see?
The successful leader today spends 80% of their time talking about what the future is going to look like, and worrying about what they don't know. In other words, they're saying to themselves, what could I be missing? What's the corner I'm not looking around that I should be looking around? And they're trying to get more insights from more people, more external information. They're not focusing as much attention on how do we operate the business, right? They're not spending all their time trying to meet the internal metrics, but rather spending a tremendously greater amount of time being very aware of the external surroundings. For years, people walked around with cell phones in their pockets, and I could easily walk up to them and I'd say, "Oh, you have a cell phone? Yeah, pick it up. Take a look at it. Oh, okay. Can you access the internet on your phone? Well, sure." And I say, "Oh, show me your business on your phone." And they would just stop. I'd say, "What? No, I want to see your business on your phone. What do you have that I can see?" And they'd say, "Well, I kind of got a website, but it doesn't really look good on the phone." Wait a minute. You're carrying this in your hand all day, every day, and you can't access your own business on it? Isn't something wrong there? That's the leap. You have to leap from saying, "Oh, here's a technology and I like using it. Oh, and look what everybody else does with this technology. Oh, look how cool that is." Because one day you're going to go, "Oh, look what my competition just did," right? And you have to start saying, "Wait a minute, this is here, it's in my hand, whatever it is, how can I use that?" So I always ask people, how could you use drones in your business? How would it be effective for you? How will this future of autonomous vehicles affect your business? How will in the future, we're not going to be making electricity with giant nuclear power plants sending it over transmission wires 500 miles. We're going to be using a grid-based system with solar and other renewable energies. How are you going to tap into that, take advantage of that in your business? How's that going to make you more successful? When we see these things, we see them coming. How are you planning for them in your business?
Speaking of energy forces, you're in the entertainment capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada, which has no shortage of energy day or night. Who energizes you? Who would be your influences, your mentors on this subject of disruptive innovation?
Well, for years, I was, very pleased that I had a collegial relationship with Clayton Christensen, who coined the term disruptive innovation in his book, Innovator's Dilemma. We unfortunately lost Clayton a few months ago to illness. And so now when I'm out there looking at the leaders that I pay attention to, and I'm spending more time not looking so much at the academics and some of the original thought leaders, but more around how the behavior of some of these leaders, how it's happening. And I have to say, I'm still very impressed with what's going on over at Facebook. I'm extraordinarily impressed with Netflix. The leadership of Netflix took this company through two major pivots. They at one point, remember they used to send us DVDs and VHS tapes? And at that point, they were the largest customer of all these transportation companies. And they pivoted in 18 months away from that business, got rid of all that inventory, all of those skill sets, and into streaming. So they got rid of all this transportation skill set and logistics skill set and moved into the tech skill set so we could go into streaming. And they conquered that world. And within 4 years, they pivot the company again and they start bringing in all these people who know how to produce and direct and make entertainment. Right? So if you said to Netflix, what's the core of Netflix? A decade ago, you would have said it's all around VHS and tape delivery and that kind of thing. And you might have said they're competing with Amazon. Boom, no. They're really not competing with Amazon because they're in entertainment. They pivot off to streaming. Oh, now they're competing with who? Oh, they must be competing with the Verizons of the world and the Comcasts of the world because they're in the streaming business. Looks that way. 4 years later, boom, pivot. Now we're out there making movies. We're the #1 content producer in the globe today. Who are we competing against these days? That sort of leadership, that ability to see the future and change your resource allocation in order to stay aligned with your customer needs, bring new technology to that customer. I marvel at that. Reed Hastings and his team have just been incredible.
In that respect, I can't help but think of the small to medium-sized business owners, and using Netflix as an example, the contrast that you just outlined, Adam, between, let's say, Netflix and Blockbuster. For the small to medium-sized business owner who's watching or listening right now, how much of this just comes down to mindset?
Well, there's two things that fit in. One is you got to have the right mindset. And the second, you have to have the right approach to resources. There was a time when having a lot of resources meant having buildings and having assets, right? Today, the smart leader starts trying to figure out how to get rid of that. Like those can become boat anchors incredibly fast. Right now, today, in the United States, we're 50% too much retail real estate. So there's going to be all kinds of shopping malls, retail stores, all that's going to go vacant in the next 3-4 years. So at one point, people thought, oh, gee, you can't go wrong buying land. You can't go wrong buying buildings. I'm sorry. If you've got a lot of commercial real estate today with office space and retail space, you can go very, very wrong being there because of the movement towards doing things electronically, right? So what we have to do is be much more flexible with our mindset and start saying, okay, how do we, as business people, small business people, adopt this notion of adaptability and flexibility? How do we get ourselves positioned so that we aren't tied just with our minds to the old way of doing business, but we aren't tied with our resources to the old way of doing business so that we have that flexibility to shift and adjust?
Adam, you've really made a name for yourself and a reputation in the field of business strategy. What are the common myths or misperceptions about business strategy?
I still spend a lot of time with people who want to focus on earnings, and they want to use earnings as a real serious metric in strategy. And that's a big, big myth, because earnings are whatever you want them to be. There was an old joke that I learned in business school that the auditor you want to hire, when you interview an auditor, you ask him a question about, well, what do you think I should do with this cost? Should I take it today or take it in the future? And a good auditor would look at you and say, whatever you want, right? I mean, the financial machination possibilities are endless, right? So it's not about earnings. It's about growth in revenue. And then trying to get people to realize that really and truly your strategy, the efficacy of a strategy doesn't have to do with the quality of your technology. It doesn't have to do with your legal position or your patents. It doesn't have to do with your workforce. It has to do with, are people buying your stuff? If people aren't buying your stuff, there's a problem, right? And you have to be that you're doing something wrong. Either it's your technology, your distribution, but some part of your business model isn't right. And the biggest myth is getting them off thinking about these other things like, well, the most important thing in my business is my employees, or the most important thing in my business is my earnings or my technology. The most important thing in your business is your sales. How much are you selling? And if you're not getting sales revenue growth, then you've got a strategic problem.
Adam, I can't, as I process this information, I'm going also back to, and I'm just going to throw this out here as a bit of a wild card. There was an Austrian economist named Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the phrase creative destruction. I can't help but wonder if his theories are still valid today and into the future based on your experience.
Well, I devote the entire forward of my book to Dr. Schumpeter. Yes, creative destruction is a powerful influence, because what he encompassed in that language that he did so many years ago was recognizing that we have these waves that come across us. And he didn't quite know what they were. He speculated they were technology, but he wasn't quite sure. But what he was saying was that you have somebody comes along with a new way of doing business with your customer, and they thereby steal that customer away, and it destroys your business. But in the process of destroying your business, this is very creative, and it's actually better for society. So, for example, do we all still wish we were, riding around in horses and, in buggies? No, because we're glad we went to cars, but that destroyed the horse and buggy business, right? So every time we do something like this, we're glad we have cell phones today, but of course that did away with landline phones in a big way. And the mobile devices are doing away with the PCs, and the PCs did away with the mainframe computers. And all of those are examples of this creative destruction. One of the things we have happening now, we're in, this sort of recession, pandemic-induced recession, but it happens in any recession. But it's also sort of a sociological issue, is people thinking that somehow they're entitled to a job. that, okay, I grew up in this town in some place and we had a factory, or we grew some wheat, or we had livestock, or whatever, agricultural, mechanical, whatever. And they seem to think, well, that's supported years ago, but now the world has changed and I'm mad and I want it back. I want it back the way it used to be. And it's never going to go back to the way it used to be, right? It's always going to go forward. And so what we have to do is start to realize that this process of creative destruction isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. The people that are saying, well, I lost my job, are also walking around with cell phones. They're looking at 4D high definition televisions where they got 24-hour-a-day programming that's on 152 channels. They got at least 7 or 8 24/7 news programs that they can watch continuously. They've got pharmaceuticals that are making their lives so that nobody thinks they're going to die at 65 anymore. They're all going to live to 95, right? We've got biopharma solutions coming along that are outdating the pharmaceutical, that are making remote medicine that, something that we're all going to be able to, just talk to our doctors and they're going to be able to help us get our solutions remotely. That's good. It's good for all of us. And so we have to realize that this is all creative destruction. The new comes along because it's better than the old. And because it's better than the old is why we want it. We're going to eat plant-based proteins, instead of eating beef, because it's healthier for us. Does that mean we hate livestock farmers? No, but we're not going to need as many steers. It's just reality, right? And so that's why Schumpeter called it creative destruction. Because in the process of creating something new, it often destroys something old. The people that are today's society-wise trying to say, I want to hang on to the old, are being very selective. They're trying to hang on to a few things while they adopt everything else. And we have to get our minds around this notion that, no, creative destruction is good. It's good because it really benefits all of us.
As I listen to you, and I think, Adam, about your own leadership journey, and of course, we're fascinated at the Leadership Standard about the very subject, given the need for everyone to pivot in these unprecedented times, how would you define leadership?
I think good leaders are the ones who are able to not only visualize the future, but be able to describe it to the important constituencies they work with. Right? And talk about that future in a way that brings them along. And so when I say constituencies, I mean your customers, your employees, the community in which you reside, your suppliers, your investors. These are all constituencies, are all important. I don't subscribe to the Chicago school that all that matters is profits or cash flow to your investor. That's not the only reason for a corporation. It's how we organize our resources to get things done. And we have to be good for all of those constituencies. But what a good leader does is they start to see where that future is, and they start saying, how do I bring everyone with me? So one of the traits that you see among the leaders of many of these top companies that are doing so well today is that they do bring people along. The fellow that runs Tesla, Elon Musk, he takes a lot of crap, to be honest. I mean, he gets beat up quite a bit. And certainly I don't think it's terribly clever to go on television and smoke marijuana when you're the head of a company like that. I mean, and that shows some thoughtlessness, to put it mildly. But at the same time, look at how he's brought people along, right? He's brought along people on his journey where he's saying, well, in the future, I see greater use of electricity. And so Tesla is not just an electric car. It's a family now of vehicles, but it's also, a solar city. And it's the production of electricity with solar panels. And Solar City has programs for putting solar on your house. And then he has invested heavily in battery technology. And then that battery technology you can put on your house. So you can actually go get panels from Solar City and batteries from Tesla, and you can take your house completely off electric grid if you want. I mean, he's taken this vision. He said, I can see where road range or range fear, which was a big problem with electric cars for a long time. I'm going to run out of power somewhere. I can't get home. He said, we can deal with that. Come on, let's get out there. Let's build up some charging stations. Let's get a network of charging stations. So the one thing he's done is he's brought everybody along. He's brought along his customers. He's brought along his suppliers. He's brought along his employees. He's brought along his community. And as he's brought those people along, he's brought the investors along with him as well. And they followed him. In my view, the investors were not the leaders. The leaders were all these other people that he got to buy into his future of what solar power was going to be like and how it would affect the way we would behave. And that's why I think despite his shortcomings, I see him as being a pretty good leader for tomorrow.
We're about to go up close and personal with Adam Hartung. Adam, on a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you?
um, I'm probably a 6 or a 7.
If there was one room in your house that resonates with you the most, which room would that be?
Oh, it's the one I'm sitting in. You can see my wine collection behind me, and you'll see my cigar humidor behind me. And so that's my enjoyment.
So I can't help but ask, do you have a favorite vintage?
Right now, I'm drinking 2010 Bordeaux's, and they're really good.
What are you curious about right now?
I'm curious as to whether we can get a common vision in the world, because I am very concerned about the sociological divide between what looks like people that want to progress and people that seem to not want to progress. On a very real way, I don't think the ones that we're positioning as non-progressive are really that way. I think there's some storytelling here that's wrong, and I really am concerned about, can we get people on the same page? That doesn't mean they all agree, but just get everybody on the same page so that we could progress together in a good manner, a nonviolent manner.
What books are you reading right now? Like, what's on the night table?
Well, I tend to be a big fan of reading the classics, so I tend to read a lot of Shakespeare and Chaucer. So I read and I reread them because I enjoy the language. I enjoy thinking through how to communicate, and so that tends to be where I am.
Besides Felonious Monk, what are the other favorites on your playlist?
Oh, Boney James, and I'm trying to see what I think now. Who are all my jazz favorites? Ellie Fitzgerald, and oh, you caught me off guard with that question. Sorry, my mind was in a different place, but they would all be jazz greats.
If there are business lessons to be drawn from the Big Lebowski, what would they be?
For me, the Big Lebowski exemplified the notion that the world is, and don't try to think you can control it. Lebowski realized that the world around him was the world around him, and he was fitting into it, and he was just trying to get out of it what he wanted. One of the things that I struggle with are people who think they can control the world. I really have a problem with business leaders who get into that mindset of, wow, I'm the leader of this team or whatever, so I'm in control. And it's kind of like, no, you're not. The world's in control. Things are happening around you. For every one thing you've got nailed, there's 999 things you don't have nailed, and 999 things you don't even see, right? So at best, you are operating as one piece of a very, very, very large puzzle. And what Lebowski said was, recognize that, realize that, be cool with that, and then figure out what you're going to do, right? And don't let it make you crazy, and don't let it make you insane. And the more I realize is when you take that attitude, it's far easier to look into the future, see where things are going, and try to say, okay, we're going to find our way there. Not get uptight, not get all worried about it. We will find our way there.
Adam, you cannot mention the number 99 to a Canadian without thinking of Wayne Gretzky, who got a plug earlier. So in Gretzky-like fashion, let me pass the puck and see if we can't do our own Adam Hartung version of the Lipton Pivot survey in honor of French journalist Bernard Pivot and James Lipton, the acclaimed host of Inside the Actors Studio. Are you ready, Adam?
I'll give it my best.
Here we go. What is your favorite word?
My favorite word, love.
What is your least favorite word?
Hate.
What turns you on?
Listening to music.
What turns you off?
People who talk like they know it all.
What sound or noise do you love?
Well, it's really hard to beat the sound of a good trumpet.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Loud automobiles.
What is your favorite curse word?
Oh, it starts with an F.
What profession, other than your own, would you like to attempt?
Oh, I would have loved to have been a professional musician.
What profession, under no circumstances, would you ever do?
Never do. Oh, there's a lot. I could never be in a job that you had to carry a gun. So security guard, policeman, any job that required carrying a gun.
Adam, I feel like we could talk for hours on your subject, but if you could somehow magically step into my shoes, is there a question you would be asking yourself that I didn't?
I think that I would ask if it's possible to get business leaders where they need to be.
Tell us, expand on that.
Well, it's easy to criticize. It's extraordinarily easy for me to, I wrote a column for Forbes, the 5 worst CEOs in America, and like it took a week for 1 million people to read it. It's very easy to sit down and pick out things that go wrong. What we know today is that there are insufficient numbers of business leaders paying attention and planning for the future, right? And so I get asked this question all the time, can we fix it? And I think the answer to that is yes, we can. We can. But in a real way, we don't have our regulatory or our government leaders understanding how business people behave. And so, if you, for example, if you held a board of directors accountable for the CEO's behavior, then boards of directors would pay more attention to long term. If we changed compensation so that the CEO compensation really was tied to long term behaviors, like results 5 years in the future rather than just what happens in 1 year, you would see a different set of behaviors. So what I believe is that it won't happen on its own. I'm not going to jawbone leaders into behaving differently when they're being compensated and rewarded for behaving the way they are today. But I do believe that we can get more thoughtful about it because I see things happening in Great Britain, in France, in Canada. I see things happening where there are people saying, let's start to hold business leaders more accountable. We've always held government leaders accountable, right? And we hold mayors and regulators accountable. But we've not really held business leaders accountable. We haven't threatened to put people in jail if they, do bad things, right? And I think that we do need to move harder on the regulatory side to push boards of directors and leaders in corporations to have this long-term perspective, to pay attention to more than the investor. I think absolutely that's the other radical thing that happened in the 1980s was this whole Chicago school thing where the purpose of the corporation is to return money to the investor and not think enough about all of the constituencies, not think enough about employees. There was a time when that seemed to be natural to society. Now we're going to have to force it. And so I think we're going to have regulations that think about the implications of the community, thinking about employees. From an American perspective, we just haven't done enough. Again, other countries have done quite a bit more than the United States, and I think we should be spending a lot more energy trying to get our leaders thinking that way.
Adam, that's so well said. I just can't, I'm listening to you and I can't help but ask, what do you think will be the greatest legacy of your work?
I hope that people will look back and say that I cared a lot more about organizations than I cared about the leaders in the organizations. There's no such thing as corporate DNA. An organization can be anything that the leadership wants it to be. Too much business today is around the leader and the leader's ego, or the ego of the top handful of leaders, the C-suite type people. And it's not enough thinking about the organization, that you're responsible for tens or 20s or hundreds or thousands of people, and that those people reach out with children and there's whole communities related to that. And I would like to think that the work that I've done, where I moved beyond Clayton and his work around innovation, is saying, what are the organizational impacts? And how do we reduce these impacts so that we don't end up with people that are disenfranchised because the shift happened? Leaders should be saying, wait, we've got a shift happen. I need to help you be ready for that shift. And then doing that with their employees, with the community, with their suppliers, helping people move in that direction. And so my legacy would like to be that people think about the whole of the organization and not just the individual.
I also can't help but ask, you've mentioned Clayton Christensen, how vital he was and significant a figure. Um, I would love to hear your recommendation for his TED Talk, because he did that. You know which one I'm talking about, Adam? The TED Talk about basically how things are measured in the end. And is there a way you can help people understand why Clayton Christensen is still someone worth paying attention to? Your dear friend.
Well, I knew him well, but I don't know that I could call him a dear friend. I would say that the reason you need to pay attention to Clayton Christensen is because he got us to thinking about what we wanted to accomplish, where we wanted to end up, and not just thinking about what we wanted to do today, but starting to say, what was our goal, what was our objective, and how do we align our behaviors to get to the objective? And for a lot of his career, he did that in the business world, and as he got a little older, he started talking to us about how we should do that in our personal lives as well. And I think he did a very good job of that. And it's important that people pay attention, because often they're reaching a point, they're saying, how did I end up here? And he's saying, well, it was what you did back there. Were you thoughtful back there? Because if you'd been more thoughtful there, you wouldn't be where you are today. And I think if we all took that message to heart and said, what I'm doing today, don't just think about what it's doing for me today. What's it going to do for me way out there?
Adam, disrupting, and succeeding through all of the different market conditions that we're facing right now, how to thrive and finding and seizing upon opportunities. You've given everyone here so much insight, and I know you've got so much more to offer. How does anyone connect with you? Anyone watching, anyone listening, how do they connect with you online?
Sure, they can go to adamhartung.com. That's the easiest way to reach me. adamhartung.com. You'll find, certainly connect me there. My email's there, adam@sparkpartners.com. And then at sparkpartners.com, you can also reach me through that one. And if you want to, there's blogs, there's podcasts, and there's even training that you can get, training modules you can pick up on those places so that you can get to know me a little better. And my phone number is actually on my website as well.
We really appreciate having Adam Hartung joining us from Las Vegas, Nevada here on the Leadership Standard. And if you want to know more about TEC Canada and its world-class programs, check out the website, www.tec-canada.com. What was it that Adam Hartung spoke of that made you stop in your tracks and think? My biggest takeaway was the contrast between Netflix, Blockbuster, and all of the thinking that went into adaptability and flexibility, as well as he had some great insights on the great Lebowski and the business lessons that will live for a very, very long time. But what was yours? What did you take away? Feel free to share your thoughts with me. My direct email is Gair, Gair, at gairmaxwell.com. And if you enjoyed the Leadership Standard, feel free to share with others in your online social networks. That's right. Like, subscribe, share, so that, hey, we might help somebody else grab a hold of the clutch and kick it up a gear and go full throttle here in the new frontier. So on behalf of everyone at TEC Canada, Stephen, Alexander, Catronell, and everyone behind the scenes, we thank you so much for joining us here on the Leadership Standard.